Welcome to TechieCastJax, where the top technology and business experts around discuss the latest trends in high tech. This podcast is hosted by Joe Holbrook, who's an experienced technologist pundit in Jacksonville, Florida.
Welcome to TechieCastJax. I'm Joe Holbrook. I'll be your host today. In this episode, I'd love to talk about what exactly it takes to become a cloud architect. Now, in a previous episode, I talked about what it takes to become a cloud engineer. And becoming cloud architect has some similarities, but there's also some differences, especially like in your job duties and some of your requirements in a lot of cases. So let's talk about that. Now, a cloud architect is really what it sounds like in the sense that you'll be architecting cloud services generally. Now, a cloud service is going to typically be deployed on a major cloud provider. However, it could also be that it's a private cloud. It could be a community cloud, whatever that is. And basically, a cloud architect is going to be focused mainly on how to put together a design that meets the required use cases. Now, for example, a company may be running on-prem and they need to migrate this application to the cloud. Well, to do that is not exactly a simple task in a lot of cases, especially if the company was not using open-based APIs, for example, or they're using legacy apps. So this can be a challenge. So as a cloud architect, this is a pretty new discipline, I think, in the world of computing compared to being an IT architect or an enterprise architect. And if you've been those roles before and you were pretty good at it, this will be a piece of cake in a lot of cases compared to being you were pretty good at it. This will be a piece of cake in a lot of cases compared to being an enterprise architect, because there's a lot more things to worry about compared to being a cloud architect typically. So what does a cloud architect exactly do? Well, typically a cloud architect are going to not only design systems or cloud environments, but they have to typically take, I like to say, ownership effectively of the environment and make sure they understand, for example, all the integration, the life cycles, the development processes, etc., and look at what the company has from both a business and technical requirement perspective and make sure that it works. Also, too, typically cloud architects have a flair of what I call pre-sales requirements. That is being able to take these requirements and translate them into a living design that works. And it sounds easy overall, but it can be pretty challenging. A lot of it just depends on the organization that you are working with and what they have available for resources, but also too, where are they now and where do they need to go? For example, if the customer is on, or the enterprise you work for, example, is on a legacy app, such as, let's say, running C+ or something for their apps, it's going to be more difficult than if they were on like JavaScript or Golang, right? Not to mention too, if there's other things that they have to add to the application, is it a microservice or is it not a microservice or is it not a microservice? There's just so many things that come into play. But generally, architects are going to design from the initial requirements. They typically define the requirements, they perform an analysis, and then they go through basically determining where they are now, of course, and then how do they get to where the customer wants to be. For example, if the customer is stating, well, I'd like to have this cloud service run on AWS. Well, that's great. If it's running, for example, on-prem, and the application is in a portable, open environment, that's different than if it's a monolithic, legacy-based solution. So these are all the things that come into play. Now, architects need to not only know the technical requirements, but also the business requirements. So what is business requirements? Well, this is basically return on investment, total cost of ownership. For example, too, does it meet competitive advantages? Can the solution provide other value points, such as, of course, going to market quicker or providing a better user experience or, saving money or reducing other costs, whatever they may be, support, etc., right? So with that said, cloud architects typically need to understand what vendors fit where, what are the APIs available, stuff like that. Now, what are some of the key skills typically? Enterprise architecture, I think, is one of the more important skills, understanding what the enterprise is about, understanding that the enterprise is really not just one application, but it's a hodgepodge of sometimes hundreds of different applications running. For example, what applications do what and how do they fit into the whole scenario of the enterprise? For example, what an ERP app does is different than an HR app, or what does a PM app, project management app, do as opposed to an e-commerce app? All of these things may sound simple, but they actually provide a lot of challenges. One of the things, too, that I think when it comes to skills for architects is, of course, number one is enterprise architecture skills. Number two is of course, having strong technical skills just in computing in general is going to help. Being a good communicator is also important. And also, too, typically cloud architects are generally in a lot of organizations, I won't say, strictly, but generally they're considered like the most experienced and most knowledgeable cloud expert. They're typically supervising in a lot of cases other architects, engineers, managers, etc. in some organizations in a lot of cases. So there's a leadership requirement there. And also, too, when it comes to leadership, I think a lot of it comes down to, can they take the vision of like the company and put it to work as well? This is important. Another thing, too, is they have to be able to critically think. What do I mean by that? Well, just because a customer tells you that they want to save money and they want the fastest service and also, a service that does 20 different things at the same time, maybe, the architect has to ask the right questions and really understand, is that what they really need and can they get there, right? Planning is a big deal. Now, typically, cloud architects don't really need to be project managers, but in some cases, having those skills can really be helpful. And lastly, some other skills that I think come into play, but not as a priority, is having that pre-sales experience, having that understanding from a holistic macro perspective down to the micro perspective is really important. Understanding like what this industry typically does versus that industry can be really, really helpful. So what are the jobs and typical salaries out there? Well, typically the jobs are, of course, going to be widely dispersed. There's roles pretty much everywhere. And to be honest, cloud architect roles are a lot of the time they're remote. You don't even need to go to the office or do anything but log into the cloud. And that's really about it. So it's a great job to have as a full-time job remote if you don't like to commute. Another thing, too, when you're considering becoming a cloud architect, this is pretty similar to becoming a cloud engineer, for example. You don't really need to have that college degree again, but having that enterprise experience is a big deal. Now, I will say, though, that a lot of the organizations do like a cloud architect to have a bachelor's at least. This is still true, even with the vendors and social media platforms. But cloud engineers are less likely to need a degree typically than an architect. At least that's what I've seen from experience. Now, when it comes to different salaries, the salaries, for example, could be anywhere from $90K at the low end to $220 in the high end. Now, Global Knowledge had a salary survey, and they came out with like the Google Cloud Architect as being the highest paid at the time in 2020. The 21 survey I didn't see yet, but when it comes out, I'll be interested to see where that goes. But basically, the salary was pegged around $171,000 as the average salary for a Google Cloud Certified Architect. Now, when it comes to building your skills, so again, you could take a cloud boot camp. I would just, to be honest, this is a role that is going to be more experience-based than like skills-based in some cases. And what I mean is typically to be a role like a cloud architect, you're going to want to have some pre-sales, post-sales experience, maybe enterprise experience. Having a boot camp is not as important, I think, as like a cloud engineer, where a cloud engineer is more focused on the day-to-day, whereas you're more focused on the business and the technical aspects, whereas, the cloud engineer is more technically focused. So I think, again, there's certain boot camps that sort of address it, but there isn't really any cloud architect boot camps that I have seen. It's mainly cloud engineer boot camps overall. And again, this is a role you get with experience, and working for a vendor is really the best way to get into it, or working for a company and then migrating to that role, I think is probably another good way as well. But with that said, becoming cloud architect is there. I have numerous courses, of course, on different platforms about cloud architecture, whether it's AWS or Google Cloud, for example. Feel free to check out techcommanders.com. Also, too, please do check out the GCPgurus.com as well.